Welcome to Lecture 3 in the Age of Jackson week. Uh, we need to address the expansion of slavery in the early American Republic because it's going to have long-term ramifications for our nation. Essentially, as lands in what is in the period termed as the Southwest, but the lands that will become the states of Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia are cleared of Native American presence, they are opened up to white settlement. Many of these areas, especially in Alabama and Mississippi and southern Georgia, will become known as the Black Belt. These are very fertile areas that are prime cotton producing lands. And so once word of the fertilities of these soils gets back to farmers living in the East, we'll see a rush to purchase large amounts of land and increase the cotton producing regions of America, of the American South, in the name of profit. Essentially, what this is emblematic of is the fact that farmers would rather buy new farms in unsettled lands and move west than taking the time and the money to improve their farming techniques and change their farming practices. If you remember when I talked about colonial agriculture, essentially in the South, plantations are so large because let's say you own 1,000 acres. You're going to grow cotton on 100 of those acres. You're going to grow cotton on 100 acres until that land is sucked dry of nutrients in the soil. You don't put fertilizer on it. You don't put manure on it. You don't graze cattle on it. You grow cotton on that land till it can no longer support cotton. And then you abandon those 100 acres and you let it sit for as much as 25 years before you return to putting that land into use. That means there are massive tracts of land that will never be brought under production or that will need to stay out of production for the better part of 3 decades, because that's how long it takes to return the fertility to the soil naturally. It's a very extractive crop, a very extractive process, destructive of the soil, and farmers would rather pick up and move than change. The new lands will create a boom in cotton production. We'll also see a boom in slavery. And by 1850, 50% of the population of the Deep South, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, will be enslaved. And remember, they have to walk together. This is an illustration of a slave coffle from the period. Essentially, a slave coffle is the means of transporting enslaved peoples over long distances. They are marched under the watchful eye of white overseers who are armed. The enslaved men are chained not only to each other, but their hands are chained together. They are incapacitated. They are tied together. Women are tied together with a rope, and you can see that the women are following in a secondary line behind the men. What's interesting, if you notice, there are fiddlers at the head of the procession. Slave sellers, slave traders, who marched their men and women in coffles to new markets, used music to keep the enslaved people's minds off of the situation as a form of entertainment and diversion. They would also keep these people drunk. They would start the day giving them whiskey to make them docile and resist moving as much. We need to remember that slavery is an inhumane institution based on the premise that African Americans are inferior and are essentially livestock in American society to be moved from place to place at the whim of their masters. The coffle, the fiddlers, the whiskey, it's all a mechanism of maintaining superiority and control over African Americans. Slavery is going to become so important in this era that we're going to see the first compromise to keep politically this nation alive. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1820, is based on the question of how slavery can or should be expanded to new territories and new states. In 1819, Missouri wants to enter the Union. There are slaves living in portions of Missouri. There are portions of Missouri that don't have slaves. And there has been a general balance between slave states and free states for the power dynamic in Congress. This is why we have the Electoral College. This is why we have the Senate with 2 representatives of each house, or each state in the Senate, and the House having a population-based body of representatives for each group. Essentially, Representative James Talmadge of New York is an anti-slavery agitator in Congress. And as Missouri's statehood is considered, Talmadge will introduce legislation that would ban slavery from any new territories and states. Essentially, Talmadge is suggesting a moratorium on the expansion of slavery in the United States. And this is not going to be accepted very well, mainly by people in the South. The South has a very small voting population. Even with the expansion of universal white male suffrage, there aren't a lot of white males living in the South. There is an ever-increasing number, however, of enslaved African Americans who cannot vote, but they are used to determine the number of seats in the House of Representatives allotted to each slave state based on the 3/5 rule. 60% of the enslaved African population will be used and added to the white voting population, thereby giving an artificial elevation in the number of people to be considered living in that state for representative purposes. If you limit slavery, you lessen the political power of the South. You take away the equality of their voice, you give northern free states more power in Congress. And this causes a fracture in this country. Should the southern states put up with the call to limit slavery when northern states have had slavery in the past? Northerners have made fortunes off of selling slaves. It creates an uproar about what the nature of federal power on the slave question is. Ultimately, we don't answer that question. Ultimately, Congress will establish a compromise that will allow Missouri to be admitted as a slave state, but it will also create Maine and admit it as a free state in order to maintain the balance of power between the states in the Congress. And this is how statehood will be done up through the 1850s. For every state that comes in, if it's a free state, you have to bring in a slave state. If it's a slave state, you have to bring in a free state. So the states are going to come in pairs to maintain the power relationships. We'll also see the banning of slavery from any new territories or states north of the line that is the 36th parallel, or essentially the southern border of Missouri. No slavery can exist above that point. That line is going to extend all the way to the Pacific Ocean, securing slavery only in the southern 25% of any future Western settlement. This is the balance that we have. You can see the green line here on the slide. There's the southern border of Missouri, and that line will extend theoretically all the way across to the Pacific. The only slave territories that can come in are south of that line. North of that line, all of those future territories and states will be free. Now, what about the Alamo, you can ask? Well, you ask about Pee Wee Herman and his view on the Alamo, and he knows now that the Alamo has no basement. Sorry, bad joke. How does the Alamo play into discussions of slavery and expansion? While Pee Wee looks for the basement, we're going to remember the Alamo. The Alamo comes into this situation through a complex relationship with Mexico. Mexico had revolted against Spain in the 1820s and created a new nation, a nation free of Spanish overlords, in an attempt to create new society. And one of the things they want to do, one of the states is Tejas. Texas is a Mexican state. It is, by and large, very sparsely populated. And in order to secure its northern borders and bring more tax-paying citizens into the Mexican Republic, Mexico will offer free land to American settlers who move there. This will begin in the early 1820s, and by 1835, more than 35,000 Americans will have moved to Texas in order to take advantage of that free land. Many of them are from the South. Many of them bring their slaves with them. In 1829, Mexico will ban slavery. It doesn't end the practice of slavery for those who have brought slaves into their territories, but it prevents the importation of any more slaves into the state of Texas. Texans, by and large, will ignore this. They see themselves as Americans first. They have not renounced their citizenship. They simply moved here for the land, and they're going to do what they wish because they are far away from the capital of Mexico City. It's an age before fast transportation, and so they don't feel threatened by the government. In the 1830s, General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna will overthrow the Mexican civilian government, and he will install a very strong militaristic central government. It actually is an authoritarian government that is opposed by many people throughout Mexico, and there will be widespread attempts to revolt against Santa Anna's rule. The Texans aren't the only people revolting against Santa Anna. All the rebellions against Santa Anna will be crushed except for the Texas rebellion. And honestly, the Texas rebellion is a failure, except for the fact that the Texans win the last battle. There are massacres of Texican troops at Goliad and the Alamo. There are defeats to Santa Anna's army almost everywhere that the two fight. It's just for the fact that the Texans surprised Santa Anna and his army and nearly wiped them out at the Battle of San Jacinto in 1836 that we see the survival of the Texans and the creation of the nation of the Republic of Texas. in that same year. So why is remembering the Alamo complicated? One of the main reasons that these people were fighting is they wanted to maintain their slaves. They did not want to give up their property, and they saw the end of slavery and the power of the Mexican government as a threat to their property rights, not in land, but in human lives. The garrison of the Alamo died defending slavery. And that complicates our image of their actions. In the same period, we also have one of the worst slave uprisings in American history. There are a couple of dozen slave revolts that take place between the 17th century and the Civil War. No slave revolts on the American continent are successful. Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia begins because of an eclipse. Nat Turner is a very religious man. He is a slave. He's an African American, but he's a lay minister. It is one of his jobs, one of his roles in life is preaching to enslaved populations in the area that he lives. He, in many ways, has the freedom to go from plantation to plantation, preaching on Sundays, because Christianity is seen as a civilizing force by whites who are looking to express more power over African Americans. In February of 1831, Nat Turner will witness a total eclipse of the sun. He will claim that this is a sign from God that he is to lead a rebellion against slavery that will be successful. He will recruit people from the plantation he lives on and the neighboring plantations, as well as free African Americans. And on August 21st, he will lead these people in a revolt against their owners. They will literally go from plantation to plantation in the area that they live, killing whites, sometimes in their beds, and freeing their slaves. The United States Army is going to be called up to deal with Turner's rebellion, the Virginia militia, and area whites who are scared of vengeful slaves will join the hunt. Within 2 days, Turner's rebellion will be crushed. 60 whites are dead. 120 African Americans, not all of whom were rebels, were killed. In many cases, vengeful whites killed any African American they saw or encountered in the area. Could have been somebody freed by Turner, could have been one of Turner's men, could have been somebody wandering through the area at the wrong time. But they will kill wantonly. They will kill almost all of the people that served with Turner, that rebelled against white slave owners. Turner will actually successfully escape for the next 6 weeks. He will live on the run until he is captured on a farm in Virginia in October. He will be tried for treason and rebellion and convicted, and on November 11th, he will be hung until he is dead, and then he is drawn and quartered. To be drawn and quartered is there's a couple of ways of doing it, but essentially your body, you are hung until you are nearly dead, your head is cut off, you are disemboweled, your genitals are cut off, and then the body is cut into 4 pieces for display in 5 different areas: the head, the 2 arms, and the 2 legs. This is literally a medieval torture under English common law. This is what George Washington and the American rebels faced as possible punishment if they would have lost the American Revolution. If you watched Braveheart, this is what happens to William Wallace at the end of the movie. This is just a primeval way of killing somebody. It's done for show. It is a very public punishment. This is a warning to any African American living in Virginia that you will be dealt with without mercy. If you live long enough to get to the courts, you will be treated as a traitor and drawn and quartered for your crimes of seeking freedom and independence. In the wake of Turner's Rebellion, Virginia will seriously consider abolishing slavery the year after Nat Turner's Rebellion in order to prevent something like this from ever happening again. What we're going to see, however, are the passage of laws that end the preaching of black ministers by themselves. They must now be watched over by licensed white ministers to make sure that they are not using the gospel in the wrong way. The gospel can only be used now to preach a message that strengthens slavery. We are going to see the passage of laws that prevent slaves from being taught how to read. We're going to see the passage of laws demanding that slaves carry paperwork with them at all times to prove who they are, who they're owned by, why they're on the road. And if they've been set free, they need to carry proof of that with them in public at all times, lest they be arrested and sold back into slavery. You literally have to carry freedom papers with you in order to prove you're a free African American. I want to thank you guys for your attention. We'll pick things up from here for next week. I hope you guys have a great day.